plans to change it, but what we would like to do is really just do what it's done in the past, but a little bit better. We're reinstituting certain old things like the catalogues, which is quite exciting, trying to offer the stock with a bit more context, a bit more of historical background to the books we're selling, that sort of thing, rather than for a number of years we got some fantastic stuff through, but we just put them up for sale on the internet and they'd vanish into obscurity, and it's sort of somehow we weren't getting a chance to tell the story along with the books, which often with books that are historical artifacts is half the fun.
And you have recently just released your second online catalog, and that is a collection of the books of Ray Burlingame?
That's correct, yes. That's just gone out yesterday.
Can you give a little background to who Ray Burlingame is?
Yes, I can. I suppose before we go into it a little bit, I should just say that what I know about Ray Burlingame is largely plagiarised or borrowed from the works of Martin Starr and Jerry Cornelius. So this isn't original resource. I didn't know terribly much about him myself until we got collection. But when we did, I researched him a bit, and but it is largely drawing from the work of those two authors.
And the works that you're talking about in particular are Martin Starr's The Unknown God, W.T. Smith and the Thelemites?
That's correct, and Jerry Cornelius's biography of Grady McMurtry. So, as you know, Ray Burlingame was a long-time member of the OTO and joined whilst it was Agape Lodge under W.T. Smith, and was active right through the years with Grady McMurtry, and in fact right up until his death in 1965. That's Burlingame's death.
What positions did Burlingame have in the OTO, or what degree did he get to?
Well, he reached the 9th degree. For a while, he was more or less the de facto leader of a Long Beach branch, apparently. Most of his time he was in Agape Lodge during the Jack Parsons, W.T. Smith period, and he was a sort of quiet but constant, remarkably constant figure in the order. He pops up in correspondence really from when he joined in 1941 right up through his death until his death in 1965. He continued to, even in that period when the OTO was very quiet, almost on the verge of extinction, he was one of the faithful that would contribute to Gurma's publication funds. And in fact, he earned Gurma's wrath in the later years because he decided to start initiating people himself and take some people into the order because he feared that it was on the verge of dying off. So he was there all the way through basically, but he's not someone that you hear a lot about.
Was there any other organization that Burlingame was involved in?
Well, he actually started off in C.F. Russell's Gnostic Body of God, which was also known as the Corazon Club, and that, as your listeners may know, was Russell was a former Crowleyite who went off in his own direction and founded the Corazon Club. He got a lot of, obviously, trouble from Crowley eventually about this, and I think in the mid-30s at some stage effectively disbanded the Corazon Club, and people like Burlingame, there are a number of ex-members who were thus thelemically inclined, interested in magic and quite serious about it, who were looking for something to replace it, and this just happened to be at the time that W.T. Smith was getting Agape Lodge of the OTO organised, so a number of ex-Corazon Club members, including Louis Culling, Burlingame, and a few other of their friends went over and joined Agape Lodge.
If I remember correctly, there was something about a theft involving the whole Solar Lodge or something in Burlingame after his death. Do you know anything about that?
not an enormous amount. Basically, one of the Burlingame has an interesting position in the history of Thelema in America, as because of his sort of continuous link almost from this original period of the Agape Lodge right through to the 60s when McMurtry started things up again, and the present incarnation of the OTO really got firing. Towards the end of his life, with Gurma not initiating and whatever, as I said, Burlingame did start doing some initiations of his own, including Jean Brayton, who was later associated with the Solar Lodge of the OTO. Apparently, it's rumoured that there were some thefts from Burlingame's library just around the time of his death. They weren't actually reported to police, so there's no real record. Nothing's entirely clear. They're commonly blamed on members of the Solar Lodge, but I don't know that, and they probably were, but no one's really got any absolute evidence. It just, they seem to be the likely figures. So.
Now, when you said you made a catalog, you don't just have an online catalog. You actually printed up a special edition catalog about this collection?
Yeah, that was something especially with this collection. Basically, it's always a little bit sad when you get something like this that is an individual's library where there's a coherence to it. You want to preserve it. On the one hand, it's wonderful to disperse it because a whole load of different people get to enjoy the books. On the other hand, it's a little bit sad to see something intelligently put together broken apart. And we thought, well, one way of preserving the memory of his collection is to do a proper small hard copy catalogue of it, which lists all the books. And at the same time, I was speaking with Martin Starr, who, as we said, is the biographer of W.T. Smith, and I managed to persuade him to write a little piece about Burlingame to put in that catalogue. So it's basically sort of memoir of Burlingame and a memoir of his library put together, and we just did a very small number of them to give away to the people that bought the books, so they get a sense of the library and the person to whom they once belonged.
Okay. Well, let's talk about a few of the books that are in it, because there are some pretty fascinating editions. Almost all of them are first editions from Crowley, or a first edition of some other kind, like the first U.S. edition of the Book of the Law. The one that I think is probably the most outstanding is one of the 20 copies of Ola, an anthology of 60 years of song.
I think I'd have to agree with you on that. It's an extraordinary book. Basically, that particular one, in fact, most people don't even know that edition exists. It was Crowley's last book published during his lifetime. It was quite literally a swan song, a collection of his favourite pieces of poetry. And as a special edition for friends and helpers, he had 20 copies printed, or a special edition, I should say, of 20 copies on beautiful paper in a magnificent binding which matched the Book of Thoth. I'm sure I don't know about the listeners, but you would know that the first edition of the Book of Thoth was perhaps the most magnificent of Crowley's publications. It's leather spine and Egyptian pattern paper boards, right. And it really is a very, very handsome special book, and this special edition of Ola matched that. Well, apparently it would seem that the story with the Burlingame copy actually was that Burlingame was a great fan. He'd written to Crowley. He was very involved, and he ordered a number of copies of the Book of Thoth. And somehow, somewhere along the line, including, of course, Crowley was going to send him a special inscribed one, half of them didn't show up. There were all sorts of problems, all sorts of aggravations, whatever. And eventually, Crowley, as a sort of apology and a thank you, sent him this special copy of Ola, specially inscribed to him, his wife, and their daughter, who was appropriately called Layla. The only problem was, Crowley, we worked out from the date of the inscription, it was the day that he wrote the inscription, and the day he wrote his very last will and testament. He was probably a little under the weather, and he misspelled everyone's names when he wrote. But I think, given his age, given the circumstances, he could probably be forgiven for that.
Right. Now, in the collection is also a Book of Lies. Is that one of the first editions of that too? That's
right. That's just a very sweet little book. It's obviously, I think, one of Crowley's most interesting works. Like all of Burlingame's books, it's well read. He was very much a practicing magician. The books to him were, they were part of his tools of trade. He read them. This isn't a sort of fine collector's library where the books have never been read. Even the Book of Thoth, which, as I said, is a magnificent thing, and most people would probably virtually put white gloves on before handling it. His has got strange stains, which I suspect are tea. Luckily, they're not too bad, but the odd splash through it, and they've clearly all been worked with. And likewise, the Book of Lies has been pretty well thumbed, but it's still holding in.
Not surprisingly, he also has a first edition volume set 1 through 10 of Equinox Volume 1. What shape is that in? Is that also in a very red shape?
Yes, I think they almost always are, though. The Equinox, oddly, wasn't particularly strongly bound in the trade edition, and Crowley liked this particular Holland-backed, I think it's called. It's a rather flimsy sort of linen spine on them, and virtually all copies that you see of that have been are starting to fall apart, or at best been knocked around. And in fact, Ray Burlingame's set isn't too bad at all, but it's just a set of books that never shows up in great condition. They just weren't designed to last. Or if they were, I think he intended it, but there was some lapse between the intention and the actuality. So.
Now, on this podcast, we also have an interview with Dr. Richard Kaczynski about his new book, The Panic in Detroit. It's kind of the story about the founding of the OTO in Detroit, as well as the efforts to get the Equinox Volume 3, Number 1 published. And similarly, that edition is in the Burlingame collection.
That's right. And again, that's actually been extremely well read, which isn't surprising because it was a very significant volume. As I'm sure you know, it had some very important texts of Crowley's in it. And it would have been much used in the Agape Lodge and circle. So definitely Ray Burlingame's copy has been much used. But it's again, luckily, that was very stoutly bound. They must have learnt from the first series that perhaps these paper boards and cloth spines weren't the best idea, and when they got around to doing the 3-1, the so-called Blue Equinox, they'd learnt their lessons and put a good solid blue cloth binding on it.
The one book that I was coveting was the full unedited edition of Magic Without Tears, although I've seen it has already been sold.
Yes, sadly, that went rather quickly. That's a hard one to find.
Yeah. Well, are there any other books that you think are worth mentioning?
To my mind, most of the books are interesting. They're all fascinating in their way. I mean, I'm a great fan of Crowley's writing, and I can see merit to all of them, but really what's most interesting is their history, the fact that they did belong to Ray Burlingame, and that a lot of them have his ownership in inscriptions have been used by him. One of them, I think, the collected works, I was just looking at it and I realised that rubbed out on the inside front cover is Regina Carl's ownership signature, and she was the first woman, as far as I know, to perform the Gnostic Mass in certainly in the Agape Lodge, probably in America, and a very interesting person in her own right, and obviously this had passed from her to Ray at some stage. I think really what's perhaps special above all about them to me is